This program is designed to provide general information with regards to the subject matters covered. This information is given with the understanding that neither the hosts, guests, sponsors, or station are engaged in rendering any specific and personal, medical, financial, legal, counseling, professional service, or any advice. You should seek the services of competent professionals before applying or trying any suggested ideas.
Good morning, true seekers and true crime junkies. Welcome back to another episode of Hit the Road, Jack, Finding the Zodiac. We didn't have a lot of research or laundry to pick up from this last week. I did have some emails that were coming in quite frequently from an individual. The email is tagged Moonlight, but I'm not divulging any names, obviously, at this point. The person's interest in the case is actually attempting to match lost or missing people with remains across the United States. And of course, they were reaching out to me to let me know about what was happening in their area and other things they thought were included, which was interesting because that meant that they weren't aware of, obviously, my entire podcast, which is something that I just basically figured out myself, is that most people are seeing only the 5 or 6 videos that I had downloaded, but not seeing the live stream videos that are on a different page. So I hopefully fixed that and created a playlist where you can go and you can find all of the videos in one spot, is my hope and goal. We're going to go ahead at this point and go full screen on the handwriting and get ourselves right back into the middle of it. Is that full screen? There we go. Okay, so last week we left off at the lowercase h's, so I'm going to try to blast through the last few lines of these real quick, but I saw things that I thought were very pertinent to the handwriting examination and that I wanted to cover as we went through it. So I want to say we left off somewhere around the 3rd line, and for everybody who's kind of catching up at this point, when we look at these presentations, if you see a blue circle, the blue circle indicates that is a direct match to Jack Tarrance in some form. If you see a red circle, it means that there is a direct match between a crime scene note where the disguised handwriting is a match. And the reason for that is because I find it hard to believe that not only do people not write alike, but that they would not attempt to use these same disguised letters another individual would use. And I think that kind of like heightens the level of the degree of the identification. So things like this H up here in the Kern letter with this elongated, we're going to see this in the letter N too, because obviously the letter N is just a shortened version of the letter H. But as you go down, you then cross-reference that with something else in red again that also has kind of that elongated. Right there is one, the elongated hump that protrudes to the right. But down here in the herb cane, we had again similar forms with other oh my goodness, with other crime scene notes. Now, of course, anything with a blue and red star on it is attributed by law enforcement and DOJ to the Zodiac Killer already. So we can take for granted that everything with a star on it is out of the same hand, even though you see differences. What we're going to focus in on is the habits that continue to occur over and over again that substantiates this comes from one person. So when we look at these H's here in the herb cane letter from the Vallejo PD, we can go over to the Sacramento letter and see some of these same fashions and same styles. As I was going through here earlier, I was just taking a look at some of these H's, and one of them that I found was extremely interesting was this particular one in Atlanta, Georgia. And albeit I did not put a circle around the one in John Benet Ramsey, but if you just sit down and take a look at these letters back and forth, you'll start to see the matches. You'll start to see the forms that are consistent with one another. Again, we see this shortened hump with the elongated exit stroke that comes out of it. That is what we just talked about up here with the Kern and werewolf murders. So for me, it is just more or less putting these things together and showing you how there is a consistency with each one of these crime scene notes. Going through here, when I was looking at things like the scorpion letters, we started to see again these particular styles that were matching with Jack as far as the hump, the retraced stem line, also the elongated H, which are elongated. Really, this one has got the long stem that is protruding to the right, which we see that Jack definitely has that hard right slant in his handwriting himself. Getting into things like the John Benet Ramsey, where it looks like it's got all of these. Well, here's another one. So we see this one right here is a match to, where did I see you at? Oh, right up here in Sacramento. So we see that how it's leaned hard to the right. We see the shape of that hump that comes down, very similar to what's going on in Sacramento. So we made several matches between the disguised handwriting in the John Benet Ramsey note with other communications throughout the crime sprees, including the attempt to make it look shaky. So I know that most people attempt to do this when you're dealing with an elderly handwriting and they're attempting to forge their, grandparent's signature or something like that. They have this perception that these tremors can happen in any location, and that's just simply not true. So when we looked at that, I want to say that one of the places we found it well was up in Atlanta, Georgia, was one of the ones that had a lot of shakiness in it. Also, that consideration, there's a possibility that he did things with the opposite hand, the non-dominant writing hand. Jack did indicate that he was ambidextrous, and he had indicated to Dennis at one point in time that he, in fact, could write and had written some of these letters with the opposite hand. Getting further down in here, we do start to see like the Voinovich from Ohio. We start to see the same similar form with the separated hump from the stem and this curvature in the exit stroke that occurs, which is very similar with what's going on over here in Tom Voigt's handwriting. All the way down to Tim Miller, which Tim Miller tends to be more like the Zodiac, where things tend to be a whole lot more disguised than normal. But you can still see in all of these humps where this angular tip or point comes up. Several of these have it, and that's what we keep talking about that's going on inside of these other letters, is this angular hump that shows up. We can see it up here in the Oakland County child murders. And when we get down here to the bottom, we start to see more of those H's that actually have the shortened stem, so it doesn't quite look like an H. But we saw that going on up here in the Kern letter. We saw it happening in lipstick. So it's pretty much all over the board where you can find this particular formation that I'm talking about. Now, the appearance and the disguise might look a little bit different, but the construction of it and the form and the ratio of the hump to the stem, all of this stuff is still consistent with one another. Moving on to the letter I did find some unique characteristics and traits about Jack's, which were that, oh, where'd you go? Come back here. Okay. So that the way he actually crosses his eyes, we had a whole bunch of leftward crossings, movement to the left. We had what looked more like a T at the top with a very small cross at the bottom. Which was very consistent with many of his eyes as he went through. Now, the opposite of that is that he has the very elongated bottom crossbar versus the smaller top crossbar. Either way, you still go down the line and you see how he still crosses a little more to the left over here. And then, of course, aside from the crossed eyes, he also has the straight eyes with no crossbars on them that he had used at different points in his life. So moving into the lipstick killer, we saw two forms. We saw the crossbars. We saw no crossbars. We also found that more crossing to the left-hand side of the crossbar, which this one, obviously, he's attempting to try and change some type of a slant in here. He's trying to pull it back to the left, but he's not really quite getting that achieved. He still has kind of a rightward motion with it, but in the Black Dahlia, we had eyes that were not crossed. And in the Sorry Mary, we went from crossed eyes to a no crossed eye. So it literally is moving back and forth between the two. In a lot of cases, I think that it looks like Jack is attempting to use what he believes is not what he's using currently at that time, but he definitely does have it within his arsenal. So we'll be talking about that as we go through some of the letters and how those differences are starkly different than his known handwriting, but the characteristics are still specific within the writing. The werewolf killer used nothing but eyes that were not crossed with crossbars. Sherry Joe Bates, again, we've got a mix of crossed bars and the letter I. And then again, like I said, you can go through here and you can take a look. So as he was trying to pull these back leftward, we can see that he tried to pull back leftward in this in the Sherry Joe Bates as well. In the Dear Draft Board letter, we start to get these funky crossings again. Now this one goes a little more to the right, but we see that those curvatures and the way that the overall appearance of it is pretty much the same. They do not look like eyes if set by themselves. Then you get into the eyes that we were just talking about that Jack is notoriously known for, which is the long crossbar on the top, the short crossbar on the bottom. And that's consistent with several of the eyes. But then we do find the opposite, which is these other eyes that Jack does, where the crossbar is very long on the bottom and the one on the top is much shorter. We did also see the Dear Draft Board drop a single eye with no crossbars. And in the Zodiac Killer, we saw pretty much the same thing. We got, again, this rightward trend or movement with it, where it crosses a little more over to the left than to the right. And that continues on. I mean, some of these are just, completely spitting images of what we see going on up here, especially the way this stem comes down and it's just barely crossed at the bottom here. That's exactly what we see going up here. Now, of course, we've got this one that's a more hard right, but we still see that was one of the uses, I think, of the disguise, like up here in Starry Mary, is that he'd make the stem really long and he'd make tiny little crossbars for the top and the bottom. So you see that occurring in some of these other question documents, like the herb cane. You can find them right here. Let's see. I did notice this dot that showed up in the Fairfield letters, and I know that that is something that he does in the symbols and the ciphers. So I'm wondering if that wasn't kind of a hint to there might be a message there or something that would point out or cause somebody to look in that particular area. When I got into DB Cooper, we did see, again, straight eyes with no crossbars. And in the Albany, again, both sets, we get some with, some without. And let's see, the Citizen letter, we again start having these rightward facing stems with the crossings to the left in the Channel 9. Again, we can see that going on there, which is extremely similar to what Jack is doing. In Riverside Phantom, a lot of the letters there were really overblown, which, some of the strokes were elongated, like this top crossbar, and we'll see in other letters throughout that communication. In OCCK, which is the Oakland County Child Murders, we did just have crossed eyebars. But again, we get to start to see this notion of this long stem with these tiny little crossbars. And even when I look at some of these crossbars that have these curvatures and things on them, you can certainly go up into Jack's handwriting and start to find those curvatures in those crossbars themselves. Let's see. In Herb Cain, well, we already know that is the Zodiac. We've got that one already. We've talked about the Atlanta, Georgia used a straight I, although the second letter in 81 for the Atlanta, Georgia child murder, we started to see these crossbar eyes, and we also saw the uncrossed eyes. So it's like we get, two out of, some of these communications, which is extremely interesting to me anyway. So I did find another dot before the I in Atlanta, Georgia, with this nice big long crossbars on this one. But as you go down, you start to see again what we were talking about up here, which is where the bottom crossbar is smaller, the top crossbar is longer. And then we even got it where he is crossing it only on one side in general. Getting down into the Sacramento, again, we have the long stem, the very short crossbars, the scorpion. There we are again with that. It almost looks like a symbol to me rather than the letter I. And we know that he also wrote cryptic ciphers to John Walsh. But if we look back up here and we look at these eyes from Jack, we're looking at pretty much the same thing. And as you go down the line, you start to again see also where he does the long stem with very short, tiny crossbars. Moving over into John Benet Ramsey, we started to see exactly the same thing happening, where the crossbar on the bottom is actually primarily to the left instead of centered or balanced on the stem. We saw these tremors in these downward strokes. Now, this isn't typically where you would see a tremor because it's very easy to pull towards you. Typically speaking, we see tremors on rounded areas, areas of turns where you turn back and go a different direction in handwriting, not necessarily in a straight downward stroke, which kind of it does definitely indicate to me that we're dealing with somebody who's attempting to disguise their handwriting and make it look shaky, I guess, if you will. If we get over into Volinovich, we saw that same style that Jack is using up there with the crossing primarily to the left. We do have, again, one eye that is not crossed at all. In Anthrax, we had a straight usage of the letter I with no crossbars, which obviously DB Cooper, Anthrax, we're seeing also what I refer to as an anniversary use. And so obviously 1971 to 2001, we've got a 30-year anniversary. And of course, this is in November, this is in September. But when I started to look at these and go back and forth, which everybody can do if you just sit and stare for a while, you'll start to see that the use of those disguised letters or disguised writing sometimes do actually fall dead on with a 20, 30, 50, 60-year anniversary of these things. Getting down into Tom Voight, it looks like all our eyes are just completely straight, no crossbars that are on them, but we do have these upticks that we were talking about earlier on some of the other letters where he kind of leaves off or jets up, but doesn't quite pick the pen up before he leaves. Tim Miller's letter in 2005, again, we saw these very tall stems with very short crossbars, and of course the eyes that are not crossed as well. In Bruce Ivins, same exact thing once again. So I did also note that between Oakland County child murder, where the use of the tall stem and the short crossbars also caused the stem to protrude through the bottom, we see that happening over here in Bruce Ivins. So we've got two types of eyes, really. We've got the eye that has the longer crossbars, and then we've got the tall, skinny eyes with the tiny little crossbars that are occurring there. Now, the lowercase I, the things that I pointed out here was literally the placement of the eye dots and the actual function or form of the eye dots, because in some cases, what we're going to see is the circular period dot, which is really kind of a big look at me. I want to stand out. I want to be different. And I noticed that that was occurring a lot in these letters, which then brings me back to how many serial killers use circle period dots or eye dots in order to make a message or what they perceive as a disguise. So we've got Jack with what I refer to as this very little tiny eye dot with a very tiny eye stem with a very tall, well above the eye itself, the eye dot. And we have the slant again, the hard right slant that we were talking about. So these are some of the things, including this style of a eye dot here, which is really more of a straight down dash. We're going to see that occurring. We also see it scoping across here. Again, it's a dash rather than a period mark. There's that uptick that we were talking about on those other eyes in Tom Voight that occurs. You'll see that happening right here in all of Jack's writing. Now, when we get over into the lipstick killing, no surprise, one of the eyes we saw was actually a circle period dot above the eye, and then the rest of the lowercase i's, I'm not sure that I could even really have pinpointed out where the eye dot was in these because the images are so bad. But when we start to get into Elizabeth Short, not only do we see the heavy circular period dots, which we know that the Zodiac is known for, we see the rightward, and of course he's trying to go backwards to the left and rightwards to the right. He's kind of all over the place here. Needless to say, we still do have these tiny little stems with the eye dot pretty far up into the air. And I saw the same thing, only we saw more of a rhyme and rhythm with the Sorry Mary letter. Now, this was primarily, most of it was actually capital letters. So to even find lowercase i's was shocking because that indicates to us that there is a use of lowercase letters. They attempted to do primarily capital letters, but the fact that we find some lowercase letters in there is kind of a hint or an indication that the all caps is probably just part of the disguise. When I got into the Kern letter following the Elizabeth Short murder, these eyes here, some swaying to the left, some straight up and down. Many of them did not have eye dots on them at all. When I got into Oswald, no shock there. Tiny little stem, eye dot way up in the sky. And that's exactly what we're looking for when we're making this cross comparison to see if Jack follows any of these same characteristics. In Sherry Joe Bates, we got to see a lot of these heavy period dots, circular period or eye dots. And of course, this one being right attached to the stem right here, very, very much an insignia that cross references right back to the lipstick killer. In Dear Draft Board, on the eye dots, we actually saw hearts as instead of a period dot or a circular period dot, which some people, and I know Terry B will be picking up on this one all day long, because as it relates to or gets into the heart that was drawn on John Benet Ramsey's hand, which he thinks is a huge clue. And we also see some of these other circular period dots, eye dots. I'm going to keep calling it that. But here's that short little tiny stem with that way high dotted up in the sky formation again. And as we go through the Zodiac Killer, we start to see this period dotting that's occurring over the next letter next to it, which is something that I do obviously show that Jack does. If we look up here, these eye dots are all actually placed over the next letter in line, not directly over the top of the eye because of that lean. We also saw the circular eye dots in the Zodiac Killer. So again, we've got some matching references that are going back and forth, all the way down to that short stem with the high in the sky. This one would be more like this dash mark that is up here rather than being just a single dot. The Fairfield letters went back and forth. I found eyes that had no dots on them. That's consistent with the Kern. We found some that are. DC, these ones all swayed left. And of course, we still have the tiny little stem with the high in the sky dot. So I do want to say that there is some, since we know that slant is the first thing that people attempt to change when they think they're disguising their handwriting, that still leaves the DC Freeway Phantom right in the mix. And I'm not quite sure where this letter was mailed from, because I don't have an envelope or a postmark or anything like that to go over with you. And it's more research in the future when we get to 1971. But if we look at this particular letter in whole, there are a lot of commonalities that are going on here. And we know that Jack didn't have to be in Washington, D.C. to actually mail this letter. It could have came from anywhere. DB Cooper, we only had 2 lowercase i's, which I was again shocked to find because this was a primarily capital writing. Albany, New York, again, we've got the tiny little stem down here, and we've got the straightened eye dot at the top, which is consistent. So while some of these look like they're just completely manipulated, this one obviously looks like it's done with speed. It's done a little faster and less care and concern in what they were doing. So this is what I would be talking about when an individual uses some type of a formation like this tiny little stem and this eye dot high in the sky. And then you start to see communications that are disguised where we've got a really long stem and a very closely dotted eye. Obviously, he believes this is absolutely the opposite of what he does, so they won't be able to make an identification. But his fault is that at some point he is going to drop something natural, and that's what I believe happened here. When we get into the SLA letter, again, we see exactly the same thing going on. We've got that little tiny stem, high in the sky dot. Citizen letter, the same. Channel 9 newsletter, we had some that were dotted, some that were not. But again, we have that longer formation with the very closely dotted eye. And we can see that just in general, that this is almost a facade, especially when you know that inside of the Zodiac's handwriting and in other letters, we have these more natural forms that appear. Riverside Phantom, the same. The Oakland County child murders, again, the same. We've got this, and this one is, to me, kind of more dead on than what we've seen before. And that is because the little tiny stem is actually curved or concaved to the left, or concave to the right, I guess, depending on how you think about that. But that is exactly what we saw up here in this letter I, is this curvature in that tiny little stem. And then, of course, that straightened eye dot that occurs again. Going on down the line, I think those are all pretty self-explanatory. Again, we've got the tiny little stem, high in the sky eye dot. Same thing with the Christmas card. Same thing with the Sacramento letter, tiny little stem, eye dot, high in the sky. Scorpion ran pretty much the same, except for we saw this, again, this grinding or this heavy period dot that we saw back up here in Elizabeth Short. And let's see where else. I think we saw some in the Zodiac, the dashboard. John Benet Ramsey, again, we have this I that is being dotted to the right-hand side. We can see that that keeps occurring. And we see in some cases, we have the tiny little stem of the I. Voinovich, we are back and forth again between I's that are dotted and I's that are not. We get into Tom Voigt's, and again, once again, we have not only the uptick at the bottom of the I, just like we were talking about on the other letters that is occurring, but we also have the tiny little stem and the high in the sky I dot. So there was very much consistency there, and I was actually able to find an I that was not dotted. So that's kind of running in rhythm. He doesn't always take careful aim to dot his I's every single time, and he certainly doesn't take the time, the care, or the precision to dot it directly over the top of the stem. It is literally over the next letter, as we see that is happening here. In Tim Miller's letter, we do have some more of that heavy period dots, I dots at the top. In Bruce Ivans, again, no shock. We have this little tiny stem with the I dot a little bit further up in the sky. I did mark this one down because this one actually, with this straightened, leaned, fully right stem, was very consistent with what I saw up here going on in Jack's. Very lean to the right. If I was to put a slant bar down through that, it looks to me like that would probably be falling just about on the same plane. All right, letter J's. Now, when I got into Jack's letter J's, we found that he had J's that he did not cross, but he also had some J's where he did cross. He also tended to cross more to the left like he did with the letter I's, as we see here. This one is a little bit more to the right, but he's never really balanced with that. He's kind of always off to one side or the next. So going through that, we also noticed the angularity of some of his J's that was occurring, including these here, very, very angular rather than rounded, which we see these more rounded, but even some of them, even if they have some roundness to them, still have an angle or an angular look to them. So getting into the Black Dahlia, the only J that we had was the turning myself in letter. Of course, the crossbar is way above the actual J stem itself. Not a lot there to note since it's the only one we have. But as we start to get into the kern letter, now I'm going to just draw this straight down with my cursor here because it is a little hard to see. It's a very bad image. But what we see is this very angular, sharp hook to the J, which is actually something that Jack does. We saw it occur again in the Sherry Joe Bates. And of course, you know, when he's not using any crossbars and his crossbars are really tiny, we start to see these huge elongated crossbars as if this is going to distract people from the true author's identity. To me, it's a facade. I mean, you're going to use the opposite of what you naturally do, again, figuring that nobody will figure it out. As we get into the Zodiac Killer, we start to see these J bars that pop up and are not attached to the stem again, quite like the Black Dahlia, but we also have some similar actual exit strokes or shapes. We do see some angularity that is occurring, and we have the S shape that we're going to talk about. It's a little more predominant in the lowercase J's when we get there. Oh, actually, I have all the J's here because there were so few to work with, but you can see down here in these lowercase J's, this curvature, this S shape that occurs inside of these letters. And of course, you can then see that also in Jack's. Going across here, we again have that angularity. In DB Cooper, again, we have that angularity also with one that looks to be a little more rounded, not quite a full hook. The Channel 9 letter is the first one we see. Well, not the first one. Clearly, we have them back here in the Zodiac. So while the Zodiac attempted to disguise using the crossbar all the way across, we see this one that is crossed farther to the right than to the left, which is, again, consistent with Jack. But we finally found a J inside of the Zodiac that was not crossed. Or actually, two right there. So hopping over into the Fairfield letter, we have another one that is not crossed. But we can see that this actual shape of the J itself is very consistent with what we're looking at in Jack's. Channel 9, no cross. The Herb Cane J actually didn't even actually have a curvature to it, so it looks more like a T standing alone there. I'm not sure. I know that some of these, just short of actually having any type of a curvature to it whatsoever, is still rather consistent in the fact that we're not getting a full-on hook underneath that J. It's almost as if he's trying to keep that from happening, because he does have this very identifying curvature that occurs on the exit stroke of the J's in his own handwriting. But that S shape is definitely very similar with what we're seeing in these, including that extracurricular entrance stroke at the top. Getting into Atlanta, Georgia, we can see that again, and the Scorpion, and even in JonBenet Ramsey. Gosh, this one actually even had the little tiny curvature that occurred in the rest of his J's up here. So we have some that look more square. We have some that look like it's a longer, wider hook that does not curl up as much as like the Anthrax letter does. But when you get into these, even into the shapes of these particular disguised writing in Anthrax, we can see that many of these hooks are still kind of falling in line with some of the hooks that were done by the Zodiac and by the Atlanta, Georgia child murderer. Lowercase J's, again, that I dot or the J dot is way up in the sky over to the right, over the top of the next letter. We have very shallow exit strokes on these, sometimes not even really looking like a J. Here's one right here that does not really have any type of a hook on it whatsoever, which is kind of similar with what's going on up here in the Herb Cane, all the way to what actually just look like eyes, because they're pretty much straight in Jack's handwriting. This was one lowercase J that actually had a hook on it, and you can see that is that wider notion, not a whole lot of curvature in it like we see in Anthrax, but more of that, what I refer to as the wide mouth or the wide boat. We do also see that up kick that happens in the lowercase J that was consistent up here in the capital J. And as we get into the Sherry Joe Bates, and this is the Dear Draft Board and Sherry Joe Bates right next to each other, you guys, we're looking at pretty much the same thing. We can disregard this little dot right here. That is an image artifact that occurred from the copying process. But if you just look at the shape of that between Sherry Joe Bates and the Dear Draft Board letter, we're looking at pretty much the same type of J. When we get into the Fairfield letters, we have the wider mouth or the wider boat J's along with the angular J's. The Zodiac Killer did stick pretty true to this particular form of almost an S shape in the J, which we saw up here in the capital letters, which we know that is already a form that Jack does. But we did start to get into in the Zodiac J's that again were straight, just like we saw over here. I mean, this one right here, I probably should have highlighted. Oh, there is a blue around this. Oh, go back. Yeah, so we got into these straight J's with almost no hook or curvature on them, which is very similar to what we see in line with Jack. And of course, we also had the more shallow version or thin exit stroke or hook of the J, which is consistent again with others. I only brought these in because they are actually T's in the Lipstick Killer's handwriting, but he did, some people actually believe that he did do this in a fashion that was to make the J and the T at the same time, rather than crossing across the top of that, allowing that stem to protrude. Obviously, still gives us that impression of a JT, but I just wanted to show the shallow, more thinner hook that occurs on that and how that compares to other smaller hooks that we were seeing in these J's. When I got into the Citizen and the Channel 9 letter, Channel 9 obviously very manipulated here. I mean, but we know that Jack has a curvature in his eyes. This is a J. We have that flattened I dot or J dot at the top. Here we've got this one that has the curvature like the eyes that we talked about back there, a little bit of an upkick here, and kind of a straight down I dot. We got into Voinovich. Again, we just have so many traits that if you were to cross-reference them back and forth, I just find it hard to believe, once again, that two different serial killers would use that same type of form. In the Tim Miller letter, we had that more shallow appearance that we found in the Zodiac. The width of the actual J hook itself without curvature just kind of leaves off to the left-hand side with no curve back up, and it's very small in comparison to some of these other ones that he attempted to elongate. Getting into Tom Voight's, I did find that these particular letter J's were just spot on with these little kick-ups or these little hooks that are coming out here that we see in Jack's. Again, we also have the I dot that is fairly high up in the sky. This I brought actually down from Jack's handwriting so that we could take a look at it. There was that I was talking about with the curvature. And then, of course, the Bruce Ivans letter J, again, very similar to what we're seeing in the I's and J's. Yeah, very similar between Zodiac. And into the letter K, which I'm not even quite sure I knew I was going to make today, so I am making great time. I wanted to talk about a couple things first before we climb into the letter K so that everybody understands what we're about to see and what that means to us. So in Jack's handwriting or in the Zodiac's handwriting, he primarily used this form of this lowercase k that we can see right here. It's a 3-part stroke. The arm and then the leg, all separate strokes. I believe that they kept referring to needing to find the handwriting that contained this particular letter K. At least that was my assumption after all of the research that I'd done. And of course, we see it again up here. However, what we did start to see as the Zodiac grew bolder and wrote more, we started to see the placement of different types of Ks. So we see the K that is a 2-part that actually has the sideways V for the leg or the buckle and the arm of the K, all the way down to we started to see the capitalizing of this K inside of the handwriting. So we've got a bunch of lowercase writing around it. And we've got this giant K that pops up. It's the defiance K, against authority. They jump out, they anger easily. There's a lot of things that are associated with these pop out letters. We saw in the Chronicle as well that he, for whatever reason, I think he thought he was going to spell it CK. But we do have this K formation, which is obviously much larger than everything else here. So just bringing that to light and letting everybody know that we started to see these capital Ks popping up inside of the middle of the Zodiac's handwriting. When we look at Jack's Ks, we're not going to find very many lowercase Ks at all. Jack typically sticks with a capital K version in the middle of all of his lowercase printing. So that tells me that his obvious choice is going to try to imitate or repeat something lowercase or something smaller than what he naturally does. And for that reason, I started to go through and I started to look at different communications. So in this would be an Herb Cain letter. We see the capital K once again popping up. And we see that the formation is no longer this 3-stroke because the 3-stroke takes a lot more time, takes a lot more effort. So unless you're literally trying to do perfect copybook, this would be a wasted amount of time. As we start to see these Ks come in where the formations are different, we also see that they again are capitalized in the middle of lowercase writing. This is the Channel 9 newsletter. I'm not sure. I want to say this one came, I think this one came from the secret witness letter in the Jill Robinson case for Oakland County child murders. Again, using the capital K in the middle of lowercase printing, although he does have some other capital letters in there. We also know that Jack does use the capital letter N in the middle of lowercase printing. So some of these are not too far out. This one may be either, it could be the S. It could, I'm not going to remember which one that one's from at this point, but we do get back to seeing that capital K inside of lowercase printing. So now as we go into the Ks, we can start to look at some of the different variations that were used. So we know that Jack's K's vary from this two-stroke sideways V on the K. A lot of times he has a little bit of a curl there. Many times he does not. He also has this long reaching arm that sticks up higher than the stem stroke. It's also about where he attaches that buckle in many cases. So we'll be looking at that too. Jack tends to do his buckles fairly high on the stem, so it's more than halfway up, and we can see that in some of these other cases. However, there are some cases where it is a little bit lower, but that's the leg coming back through. The arm itself is still crossing at a point that is higher than the actual, or higher than halfway through the stem. So getting through that, again, all these curvatures. This is the one lowercase k we're going to talk about when we get into it, but it kind of gives you an idea of that form with that leg that sticks out at the bottom. I'm pretty sure that this one was more of a cursive version, which we're going to talk about in Jack's own handwriting when we get to the lowercase k's. Not a lot that we can really say about French because we couldn't see much of it, but we can tell from the length of the stem that the actual arm that comes up there again is crossed at a point that is higher than midway. Getting over into the Sorry Mary letters, we start to see more Ks that are more consistent with what Jack has going on. Sherry Joe Bates and the Dear Draft Board letter, once again, no surprise. We have extreme similarities between these letters, and that's because they're written close in time. So we're going to see similarities during that. I see a lot of similarities between the Tom Voigt and the finale letter, or the Vowinovich letters, and the Ramsey notes. We're seeing consistencies between those letters because, again, they're written in a close to the same time frame. When you get over into the Zodiac Killer, again, this is that 3-part K that they talk about. We've got that little kick up that happens at the bottom of the K, which we know that Jack does. The Fairfield letters, completely manipulated, made to look shaky and made to look completely wonky. But we see that that's what they did down here in the Atlanta, Georgia Killer communications as well. And we do see the V on the side, but we also see the 3-part where the leg is actually executed outward from the arm, which is consistent with what's going on in the Fairfield letters. In DB Cooper, not only did we see this long curvature again in what, like I said, is something that occurs in Jack's handwriting. We see the sideways V, but we also see this one is the arm that comes back and the stroke that comes down. And this K obviously is very similar to another K that I've found inside of these particular communications. But see this particular one here in the Oakland County child murder? I mean, again, with these elongated arms that come out nice and wide. And even the shapes of the bottoms of these Ks as they come out. So I found that these were consistent with Ks, the bottom portions inside in regards to the ratio where it's crossed. We can see how much of the stem sticks up there and how much of the stem sticks up there. We've got that K arm that sticks way up in the sky, just as Jack does on his own Ks. Going back and forth here, let's see, I found similarities with the Anthrax Ks. We definitely had some similarities that were going on here. Now, when we look at the cross-reference between Tom Voigt and the finale letters, one of the things I noticed was that this arm came back and then they almost retraced it for a little bit and then came down. Although we do have that V shape that does not have that form of the buckle. When I got over here in the finale letter, that is exactly what we saw. We saw the arm come down and then retrace itself and go back up. So there is some consistencies there. And then in fact, we saw one of the Ks in the Tim Miller letter where we saw this V shape on its side again. So we note that these are likely disguised versions of the K when we start to see somebody drop something a little more natural that takes less time to do, because it is easier to do a 2-stroke than it is to do a 3-stroke K. Now that brings us into the lowercase Ks. I did some slant work on this, and that's because I felt like we had enough room in order for me to do that. You could still see it. There's not a lot of letter Ks in some of these communications, so I had a lot more room. When we deal with Jack's lowercase Ks, I was only able to find 3. Now, I know if I went through, I would just have to compile all of his stuff to even come across them. I'm going to find them more likely in his cursive writing than I'm going to find it anywhere else. But I wanted to show you that he has this K where the arm comes all the way back down to the bottom, just like we were looking at in the Tom Voigt letters here, where the arm comes all the way back down to the bottom, a retracing, and the leg comes out. We also have this hooked or the rounded bubble that occurs in the lowercase k, all the way to what I refer to as what looks like an H. And the reason why I brought this one up is because Jack does this with his K in his signatures, and I started to see these kind of similar style Ks that were popping up, such as the Dear Draft Board letter. So rather than actually using what he did here was this two-stroke, we started to see just a hump where he didn't actually even bring it back, which I thought was extremely interesting, because here this K does not come back and meet as we see happening over here in the word look. Now, knowing that we've got Ks where there are looped buckles and arms, we know that that is something that Jack does in his cursive. We climb over to the Werewolf Killer. Now, this is where we started seeing these three-part Ks with this funky little leg, but what I wanted everybody to notice was that this arm is short and it jets to the right, so it's not making that upward movement that we saw happening in some of those capital letter Ks. And as I went down and started looking at stuff in the Zodiac's letters, well, look over here in Oswald. Again, we have that leaning rightward K. We have the arm that is short and jetting to the right, and that's consistent with what the Zodiac was doing, folks. Getting into some of the SLA and the Albany letters, we see that consistency that occurs with the V shape, much taller stem than the rest of it. Again, the Citizen letter, we have that rightward jetting arm of the letter K. Getting into Riverside Phantom, we see that this one is extremely similar, obviously in formation with the Dear Draft Board, where the stem is not near as tall, but the little tiny arm that comes off with this very long leg off of the K, which is similar between the two. Even in the Herb K to Vallejo, we see that arm goes off to the right instead of up into the air. In Atlanta, Georgia, I have not done any cursive. I just brought this in because, of course, I saw that Jack does this larger loop up here in the actual K. That occurred down here in the Atlanta, Georgia, but I will be looking forward to getting into the cursive in general once we get there. The Atlanta, Georgia Killer, this particular K, the way we see that this is formed right here, I think you're in the wrong spot. I don't think you belong there. I think this actually, I'm sorry, you guys, I'm going to have to take that one out. So pay no attention to this, but we do start to see again the same slant, the same three-stroke formation that's occurring with the letter K. This one actually draws back down to the bottom with the leg coming off the side, which is what we see happening over here in Tom Voigt. No matter how wonky this is, they still connected at the same point, and the tiny little leg that is happening there. And moving on into the Sacramento letter, again, this is Zodiac, known to be Zodiac. We see the same type of construction and slant of these letter Ks. Not shocking, getting into the Scorpion, where we see, again, this arm that is jetting to the right, because these Ks look like they're pretty much falling over. And when we got into the John Benet Ramsey, not only did I find some similar slants with the arm bars, like with the Atlanta, Georgia Killer, but I also found the similar shape and formation that we saw happening in the Dear Draft Board letters. So again, more consistency. Let's see, where did I find this particular guy? Well, we're down to about a minute here, you guys. Let me just finish that off real quick. We can see the consistency with these particular Ks and Jack's Ks. So Jack does have a direct link or match with what's going on in the Tom Voigt letters, as well as these Ks in the Tim Miller letter. Again, we see that three-stroke K that's occurring that is very similar to the disguise the Zodiac attempted to portray. And in the Bruce Ivans, again, we have this jetting rightward arm. We have it drawn down to the bottom and back up, which we just got done talking about. Where did we see that? Over here in the Atlanta, Georgia. So basically using that same formation, almost making the stem and the arm look like a V with that tiny little kick out of the leg. All right, you guys, that's pretty much all I have for you this week. I'm excited that we made it through the Ks. It means we're getting a little bit further. I'm able to move through these a little bit faster. And I'm excited to continue on next week with the L's. Everybody, enjoy yourself. Have a wonderful weekend. Happy Easter, and we'll see you next Friday. Thank you so much.